here in the room. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting tonight's discussion between author and investigative journalist Debbie Bookchin and Professor Todd McGowan about the re-release from AK Press of Murray Bookchin's The Philosophy of Social Ecology. But before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional land of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our curated inventory of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country, and if you haven't checked us out yet, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. Unfortunately, with the ongoing pandemic, we continue to be on hiatus from in-person gatherings and have transitioned our community and author events entirely to an online virtual space. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. Notably, for those interested in learning more about social ecology and its impact on our contemporary political landscape, in June, we're hosting Janet Beal for the release of her graphic novel about the time she spent in Rojava. And also in June, we'll host a discussion between Yavar Turinsky and Brian Tokar of the Institute of Social Ecology about Turinsky's new book, Concepts for a Democratic and Ecological Society. So if you're interested in signing up for either of those events or any other events through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. A note for those attending in the live audience: there will be time at the end of today's conversation for Q&A. So if you are interested in asking a question at any point, I'll encourage you to submit them throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you are following along on the Facebook live stream. Okay, moving on to tonight's author and speakers. Murray Bookchin was an active voice in ecology, anarchist, and communalist movements for more than 50 years. His groundbreaking essay, Ecology and Revolutionary Thought, was one of the first to assert that capitalism's grow or die ethos was on a dangerous collision course with the natural world that would include the devastation of the planet by global warming. Bookchin is the author of The Ecology of Freedom, among 24 other books. In the essays of The Philosophy of Social Ecology, Bookchin compellingly invokes the ideas of mutualism, self-organization, and unity and diversity in the service of ever-expanding freedom. Deeply philosophical, the essays take issue with technocratic and mechanistic ways of understanding and relating to nature. More importantly, they develop a solid, historically and politically based ethical foundation for the field of social ecology. Debbie Bookchin is an investigative journalist and author. She has published in The Nation and Atlantic Monthly, among many other venues. She is co-author of The Virus and the Vaccine and co-edited The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies and the Promise of Direct Democracy. Debbie has been working with AK Press to bring out new, revised editions of some of Bookchin's other books, which will be released later this year. So keep an eye out for that. Todd McGowan is a professor of theory and film at the University of Vermont. He is the author of Emancipation After Hegel, Universality and Identity Politics, Capitalism and Desire, and Other Works. So Debbie, Todd, thank you so much for being here tonight, and I will go ahead and pass it over to Debbie.
Thank you so much, Ash, for the lovely introduction, and also everybody at Firestorm for making this evening possible. And thank you, everybody out there, for being here. I was listening to the news today, and between the many deeply upsetting reports about the situation in Ukraine, there was, of course, the big item about how Elon Musk is buying Twitter. And while in one sense it's a minor blip on the scale of world events, as everyone knows, Musk's stated free expression policy will also result in the readmission of Trump to the platform and the subsequent obsession by news media with his every tweet, which will, I'm sure, aid his resurgence in time for the 2024 presidential campaign. And whether he wins or loses, it's kind of impossible to ignore the fact that it's just another step in the direction of creeping fascism. And I found myself wondering, how can it be that we've come to a place where a single person can control not just $1 billion, but hundreds of billions of dollars, and therefore the entire political trajectory of the supposedly most democratic country on earth? Something is very wrong with this picture. And at the same time, for various reasons, I've been thinking a lot about how radically different the environment was that I grew up in compared with today. I came of age in the early 1970s, and there was a sense of possibility that infused everything in that era that was truly breathtaking. I sometimes feel sorry for people who never knew this period, because there was an overarching sense of possibility, of freedom. And for a huge swath of the population, labor was a relatively small part of life compared with today. And that opened the door, of course, to spending time on many other activities, political and cultural to be sure, but also the simple pleasures of social communal activities that make one feel psychologically healthy rather than isolated and deeply stressed, which is how so many people feel today. And I don't mean just because of COVID, I mean because, of course, neoliberalism has transformed society into a highly oppressive mechanism over the intervening decades, as we all know, in which basically 99% of us are essentially enslaved physically and psychologically in a system that profits a minuscule minority of the population. So the question that we have to ask is, how did society become so profoundly irrational? How can it be that at a time when we have unfathomable scientific and technical capabilities, society is on the verge of self-immolation in every respect, from the destruction of the human psyche to the destruction of the very basis of life on Earth? That's a question that my father, Murray Bookchin, tried to answer in one form or another, really over a period of about 70 years, considering that he kind of first began as a Marxist when he was 9 years old, of studying and writing and activism. And what I thought I would do is talk for about 10 minutes, a little bit about that and about the observations in this book, and then turn it over to Todd, and then would be very happy to hear from our audience with questions, comments, and observations. So one of Bookchin's first and most enduring observations was that all ecological problems have their root in social problems. And I'm sure that many of you know that that concept is the foundation of the body of ideas that he termed social ecology. He elaborated this concept by showing how not just economic oppression, but more fundamentally hierarchy and domination, which preceded even class society, had to be eliminated in the social world if we want to eliminate them in the natural world. Because the very idea of dominating nature stems from the many forms of social domination that we endure today, of patriarchy, racism, sexism, LGBTQ oppression, ableism, ageism. There's so many other forms of status, all of which he felt had to be eliminated in order to heal our relationship with the natural world. But one of the issues that any social philosopher confronts on the most basic level is the question of why a particular social system should be preferred over another one. Why one and not another? As anyone on the left knows, there are endless debates about what types of social organization are best. And he set out to see if he could find an objective basis for his claim that the best society was a radically decentralized society in which politics occurs on the most elemental level possible by individuals in their communities. So he was trying to ground his ideas about society and freedom on an objective basis. In other words, to derive an ethics that could provide a framework or basis for our decisions about how we choose to organize society. And these are the ideas that are laid out in the essays in this book, The Philosophy of Social Ecology, which, as Ash said, has been newly revised and released by AK Press, and which now contains an beautiful, illuminating new afterword by Todd. In this book, my father employs a dialectical approach to history and reason to ask and answer the questions: what is nature? What is a human being's place in nature? And how can we intervene in nature in a rational way? And this has always been one of my favorites of the 24 or so books that he wrote, because he attempts to answer a question that has, in a sense, haunted human history. How can we avoid the relativism of an ethical credo that just says any opinion is as valid as any other, while at the same time avoid foundering on earlier invocations of nature philosophy as a means of enforcing domination, blood and soil, those kinds of interpretations of nature. So he's both trying to transcend the largely subjective ethics of our contemporary world, and at the same time resurrect dialectical thinking such that it helps us find an imperative for justifying the organization of society along democratic and communalist lines. And he does this over the course of 5 essays, which I happen to think are really beautiful essays, and which can be read in sequence, but also work as standalone texts. So just to go into a little bit deeper into the theme of the book, in the course of these essays, he distinguishes between first nature, which he defines as the natural world as it existed long before human beings came on the scene. So basically non-human nature. And second nature, which he describes as human beings who are, of course, derived from nature, but have developed a uniquely human culture with a wide variety of institutionalized human communities and symbolic language and powerful human technologies and techniques. Human beings are unique in having a cultural and political life that doesn't exist in first nature and that transcends first nature by virtue of our self-consciousness. So in that sense, we are, as Fichte said, nature rendered self-conscious. Humanity then is a product of nature and has a vast capacity to alter nature, but also doesn't have to be in opposition to nature. This human nature or second nature is, of course, right now horribly distorted by capitalism, private property, the state, hierarchy, relations of domination, and class. In one of the essays in the book, Thinking Ecologically, he describes how social evolution has taken an increasingly hierarchical form. He says social evolution unfolded in the direction of hierarchical, class-oriented, and statist institutions, giving rise to the nation state and ultimately, albeit not inevitably, to a capitalist economy. In our own time, the massive penetration of this economy into society as a whole has produced an even more serious distortion of second nature. The market economy, which all cultures from antiquity to recent times have resisted, has become a market society. Our society is historically unique. It views society as a realm for possessing things rather than for elaborating human relationships. It creates a morality based on growth rather than limit and balance. And of course, he goes on. But if you look at nature dialectically as striving toward ever greater complexity, consciousness, and subjectivity, you can see an imperative for human beings to take an altogether different path. So he says, for example, we have to ask, what is truly real? And here I will quote him again briefly. He says, is it the incomplete, irrational what is, or the more fully developed rational what should be? So reason has the obligation, he says, to explore the potentialities that are latent in any social development and deduce its authentic actualization, its fulfillment and truth in a new and more rational social dispensation. It would be philosophically frivolous to embrace the what is of a thing or phenomenon as constituting its reality without considering it in the light of the what should be that would logically emerge from its potentialities. And then he points out that in fact, that is exactly, we don't do that either in practice. In fact, we rightly evaluate, for example, an individual in terms of his or her known potentialities, and we form understandable judgments about whether the individual has truly fulfilled himself or herself. So when you look at it this way, in terms of the unique potential of human beings, you can see that human beings have a moral responsibility that cannot exist in first nature to give voice to nature's striving for ever greater complexity by using our uniquely rational powers to intervene in the natural world. And I'll just read two more sentences here. This is from the essay in the book, Freedom and Necessity in Nature. And he says, a humanity that has been rendered oblivious to its own responsibility to evolution, a responsibility to bring reason and the human spirit to evolutionary development, to foster diversity, and to provide ecological guidance such that the accidental, the hurtful, and the fortuitous in the natural world are diminished, is a humanity that betrays its own evolutionary heritage. It surrenders its species' distinctiveness and uniqueness. So what he's saying is that above all, the role we human beings were made for, to intervene in the natural world by creating ecological stability and also importantly, creating societies of ever greater diversity, cooperation, creativity, and freedom, is the role that human beings truly must play, that there's a sort of an imperative for that. In other words, and these are ecological, basically feminist communalist societies, are what he describes as free nature, that he sees as kind of the culmination of second nature's intervention in first nature. So he felt that as human beings, we have an intrinsic worth that no other natural creature possesses, and a moral obligation to create societies that fulfill this promise. And this is the philosophy that he called dialectical naturalism. So the question is, how do we intervene in the natural world? Is it irrationally with extractive, exploitive fervor that destroys the very basis of life itself? Or can we find a ground for intervening rationally so that we can have a symbiotic relationship with the natural world and indeed bring its lessons into our human communities, since the foundational features of ecological balance are, after all, symbiosis, mutualism, unity and diversity, complementarity. A rational view of the social world would remind us that in nature, those ecosystems that are most stable are the ones that are most complex, and that species survival depends on cooperation more often than competition by far. That mutuality in nature provides a social model and also reminds us that we not only have the potentiality, but the obligation to act rationally in our approach to nature and society. So to conclude, as this book drives home, for my father, the need to create an ecological society based on directly democratic forms of social organization isn't just a random choice that we make. It's not just a matter of personal predilection in which you might say, well, you prefer a parliamentary government, I prefer a centralized government, someone else prefers a king or a benign dictator. What he's saying is that if we can agree that nature is striving towards ever greater consciousness and freedom, and that human beings are an expression of that, then the imperative to create an egalitarian, grassroots democratic society stems from a recognition that that is the most obvious rational choice. Because if we look at nature dialectically and see it as an unfolding of ever greater consciousness and think about what role human beings have, we can say there is truly this tendency toward ever greater complexity and diversity and freedom. And that a communalist approach in which people make decisions on the local level, not by electing representatives who make decisions for them, but by doing it in popular assemblies themselves with delegates, which is a whole other subject about how communalist or libertarian municipalist politics might work. But that idea that then you have the greatest exercise of freedom that human beings can have. And therefore, there is an ethical imperative to create societies based on this form of assembly democracy. So I think, in a sense, it's impossible to properly understand Bookchin's entire project of social ecology without understanding the ideas in this book, which makes it very important to his work, but also, more importantly, at a time when we are facing both extraordinary ecological dislocation, as well as so-called solutions that are ever more technocratic and authoritarian, this book offers a profoundly insightful roadmap for resisting those pressures and demanding a revolutionary approach to the organization of society based on an objective ethics that prizes freedom as the only truly rational imperative and as the antidote to the grow or die mentality that has basically brought us to the brink of destruction. So thank you very much, and I will turn it over to Todd.
Thanks, Debbie. That was really great. And I have to say that I've never followed a speaker who mentioned Johann Gottlieb Fichte before. And so I'm really thrilled by that. So Debbie and her mother, Bee, asked me to write the afterword, and I was delighted to do it, in large part because I sympathize with the project of Murray, and also because I think a lot about Hegel, and Hegel plays a large part in Murray's book. And it was interesting to me because most leftists of Murray's time are really suspicious of Hegel and from a Marxist perspective. And I think I always think of this joke when I think of that. So after Hegel had been dead for about 15 years, they dug up his body. And when they pulled it out of the grave, they found out it had marks all over it. So that was, I guess, not that funny. So I invented that joke myself. So anyway, so I want to pick up on a couple of things that Debbie said in terms of Hegel. And the first thing is that so David Hume made this very famous claim that you could never deduce what should be from what is, right? And what Debbie said, and I think this is right, is that Murray is really trying to challenge that. And I think it's interesting that he finds the basis for challenging that in Hegel's thought, because Hegel, one of the things that he does is he writes his biggest, most important book is called The Science of Logic. But so it's about logic, but it's also about, and he said this, that logic is ontology. So that logic, which we think of as this purely human thing that just is involved in how we calculate things, because it's for Hegel, a dialectical logic, that is a logic based in contradiction, it actually derives from how things really are. And so Hegel already is trying to bridge this gap between how things really are and then how things should be. And that we can actually, if we think about how things are, and if we think about the dialectical structure of how things are, especially the point that Debbie made, this relationship between a first and second nature, which is an idea first articulated by Schelling, but very important to Hegel. That idea, if we think in those terms, then we can think that actually there's within the way things are a sense of how things should be. So I think that to me, one of the most important parts of the project is to say that distinction between how things are and how things should be is not impermeable, but there actually is a sense of how things should be from the way that things are, and I think it becomes legible if we understand the way things are in a dialectical sense. That is, in a sense of, as Debbie pointed out, a sense of movement, but also a sense of contradiction. And so Debbie pointed out that that the structure of society and the structure of the world is moving toward greater complexity. And for Hegel, that means it's moving towards more radical contradictions. And what's interesting to me is that, so for Marx, contradiction is a negative thing. Like contradiction is what besets capital. It's why capital will ultimately be overturned. So for Hegel, it's almost the opposite. For Hegel, the problem with capital is that it tries to obfuscate its contradictions, like the contradiction that Debbie pointed out, that we have people making hundreds of millions of dollars controlling the lives of billions of people, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars controlling the lives of billions of people. For Hegel, the bringing out the contradiction is what thought does, and so and what political action does. And so the project of capital is to hide contradiction and allow it to be operative, but never to be avowed. And so what's interesting about Murray's project is that he pushes that forward so that we can, what he sees as this increasing complexity is an increasing sense of the real contradictions that become apparent. Okay, so that's one thing that I think is a really important development in what he's doing here. The second thing is also a point that Debbie raised, I want to just build on. So prior to Hegel, there was a philosophical tradition of German, he's right in the middle of it, or the end point maybe, of German idealism. And it starts with Immanuel Kant, and Kant is in some way the paradigmatic thinker of modernity. And one of the things that he did, his first book, or not first book, but his most important book, is called The Critique of Pure Reason. And it's about the limitation on reason, and that if we try to reason too much, if we don't restrain reason, then it goes out of control. It speculates about things that it can't know anything about, and then it leads into what Kant called antinomies. And one of the things that Hegel does, and this is something that's very important for Murray in his attempt to redeem reason, is that he says, well, actually, what Kant thinks as the failures of reason are really its successes. That reason actually is successful about thinking the natural world, thinking being, there's an ontological bearing to reason. And so there's this radical switch or turn in Hegel to a complete redemption of reason and its ability to see the complexity, the contradictions in the world and grasp them in a way that Kant thought that we couldn't do. And what's interesting is I think Kant has basically won the day, and he even won the day on the left. So I think that, there's a whole tradition in 20th century leftism, and Murray is critical of this tradition, like of the Frankfurt School, and the kind of a sense of like we need to that reason is actually responsible for things like Stalinism, Holocaust, and Murray is really resistant to that idea that those are actually explosions of unreason or irrationality. And I think that seems to me right in keeping with the Hegelianism of this book, because that's Hegel's basic idea that what we don't need a critique of reason, we need more reason. And I think that that's really, really important. And I think that that's a legacy of Hegel that I find really nicely brought out in Murray's book. I just want to say one final thing, and I make a lot of this in the afterword. So Murray was one of the few, so he wrote this book, these essays in the 1990s. And at the time, there was almost no one on the left that was really marshaling Hegel in the way that Murray does. And since then, Hegel's become a central reference point for a lot of leftist thinkers in the interim. So now, I was just at a conference over the weekend, or I wasn't there, I was participating in this way. And almost everyone was a leftist thing, and almost everyone was referring to Hegel. So it's kind of come around, but at the time, it wasn't a popular move at all. And so I really appreciate that he was doing that. And one of the things that he does is he makes this distinction between, so Hegel very famously says that what is real is rational, and what is rational is, I should correct that, what is real is actual, and what is actual is rational, what is rational is actual. And Murray makes and I already made the mistake of the bad translation. So one of the important things about that idea, most people have said, well, what Hegel's doing is just justifying the Persian state that was in power when he was writing, and that idea dominated for a long time. But it's clear that Hegel actually is making this distinction between what's real, Realität is the German word, and what's actual, Wirklichkeit is the German word. So, and by making that distinction, which Murray draws a lot of attention to and gets a lot of mileage out of, I think importantly, by making that distinction between the actual and the real, the actual and reality, he allows us to see that, okay, there's a certain social reality that we exist in, capitalist, corrupt, misogynist, racist, etc. And then there's an underlying actuality that's actually egalitarian, full of solidarity, free, all these things. And so the point is to recognize the actual within the real, which then, that's the theoretical task, which then helps to bring about the actualization of that actuality, right? So it makes it, or the realization of that actuality. So it makes the attempt, the political attempt, is to bring the real and the actual to coincide in a way that they don't coincide in the actual world. So I think that's to me one of the main contributions of what Murray's doing here, and that's something that a lot of subsequent thinkers or contemporary thinkers with Murray who are mobilizing Hegel as a political source have really taken up. So I think that just those, I guess that's three basic points that I wanted to make in reference to Hegel, and basically I think what Debbie said, she captured what the book is doing pretty well. So I just want to give this philosophical background to it, and I'll stop there.
I would be, I think that's fabulous, Todd. Thank you very much, because your grasp of the whole history of philosophy really adds to the conversation. And I think, one of the things that what you said is reminding me is that, of course, part of the imperative for people to act is that Murray is, while he really is a huge proponent of the Hegel, of the dialectical method, one of the things that he also says, though very clearly, is that there's no teleological finality to these things. So it's like there's a latency, the potentiality is there, yeah, but it's up to human beings to actually make that those rational choices and bring the potentiality into being. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, Debbie, I'm really glad. I just totally forgot to say something about that, but that's really good. So one of these misunderstandings of Hegel that really predominated, that Hegel's a teleological thinker, history's progressive, it's headed to a certain thing, but okay, so completely wrong. So Hegel's idea is we don't write history, and this is how he's really radically distinct from Marx, I think, that Hegel thinks we don't write history from the present to the future, or from the beginning to the present. Instead, we write it from the present backwards. So every account is always a retroactive account that explains how we get up to the point that we're at. And so for him, he has a very famous line, and if people probably know any line from Hegel, they know this, that the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the falling of dusk. This is from the preface to the Philosophy of Right in 1821. And what's interesting is, so it seems like what he means by that is philosophy can't give advice to politics. And why he says that is that he thinks the future is so radically open that we can't theoretically map out where we're going to head. So it's exactly what you said, that there's no teleology attached to Hegel's philosophy. And again, I think this is why Murray found it a fecund source for his speculation. And I think that the fact that we don't know where it's going is actually that's the imperative to act politically, right? Like if you like in a sense, I think that's a problem that's beset the Marxist tradition, right? That you had an idea that we know where it's headed to the proletarian revolution, but instead the future is radically open, because all we're theorizing is what the past is, how the past has led to our present. Then what becomes of what we're doing is open to us. So it can go in any direction. It can go toward fascism, as you pointed out. It seems like that's where we're headed, but it can also go toward an egalitarian society as well. So I think that's, incredibly important that there's a non-teleology attached to Hegel's thought that I think gets misunderstood when he's usually thought about.
And it's interesting because I see that there's a question that's come in, which I could ask Ash. Is it okay to go to the question? We can perhaps answer this question because it sort of also addresses the question of sort of what is the sort of activity that people have to undertake. And I don't know if let's see if we can just read the question. I'm just going to try and read that. basically the question, or I will summarize it, was basically the question was, is there any group that is, or any sort of movement that is putting some of these ideas into practice right now? So, and I would say that it was a really good sort of entree to get into another topic that I work on, and which is what the Kurds have been doing in Rojava. Obviously, you know, and it's not just the Kurds. There are other many actually experiments in this kind of democratic, decentralized effort to really reclaim power. You know, one of the things that Murray said was that there will always be power. The question is whose hands will the power reside in? And I think that we're seeing it happening on different levels in many different places. There's a growing municipalist movement. And I think it's worth mentioning here that there will be upcoming seminars, which I'm sure you can find out about online, by Symbiosis, which is a kind of umbrella organization of municipalist movements in North America. There's the municipalist movement in Europe, and then, of course, importantly, the Zapatista movement in Chiapas in Mexico. And the other one that has been getting more attention, partly because of Bookchin's influence on it, has been what the Kurds are doing in Rojava. And they are really trying to implement a kind of a grassroots democracy, and the whole sort of premise there is that a society can only be truly free if people at the most, you know, grassroots level in their local communities are participating in everyday life in the politics. So it's a kind of an effort to reinvent politics in the sort of in the Aristotelian sense as a high calling of human beings, although without the Greek problems of slavery, of domination of women, you know. So in Rojava, of course, as I'm sure a lot of people here know, feminism is one of the main pillars of society, and so women play a very active role. And we could get into a whole long discussion about what the Kurds are doing, but I would just say there's just a lot of exciting information about that as well available out there, and it's definitely worth looking at. I mean, the only thing that I would say is that obviously they have a unique situation in the Middle East because the Syrian state to some extent withdrew from that region of northeast Syria where the Kurds have really reshaped society. We, on the other hand, have to figure out ways to push back against the state. And there's all kinds of, you know, there's again, all kinds of exciting discussion and debate and conversations about how to do that, how to try and build something towards a dual power that would allow us to really institutionalize these kinds of assemblies and empower them on the local level and make them have a kind of, you know, push back towards the state. And I see that there might be other questions. And I'm wondering, Ash, are you going to moderate these, or should we just have a look at them? And how would you like to do that?
Sure, yeah. I'm more than happy to come back on the screen and do some moderation here. And thanks for those, you know, sort of like opening statements to these conversations. I think that was really good. Cool. I mean, maybe I will just dive into some questions here. So the first one I'm seeing actually has to do with Rojava. This person is asking if you're familiar with critiques of the project, you know, and this might be getting a little specific on the topic. So I'm sorry to anyone in the audience who doesn't know a whole lot about the region and the project in Rojava. But there is a person asking if you're familiar with any critiques of the project, and if you see any flaws or room for improvement in the project. There's a couple folks here who are referenced, Hammy and Miley and Schmiedinger. I don't know if you can see those names there, but basically, if in terms of what is happening in Rojava, are there ways that the project is sort of falling short of some of their aspirations, and is there opportunities for growth and improvement?
Okay, well, I'll address that one kind of quickly, and so that we can sort of move back to some of the ideas in the book. Yes, I'm familiar with this critique, and I think it's really important for there to be constructive criticism as part of any radical movement. I mean, we have to be able to engage in constructive, critical observations, commentaries, debates, and discussion. And one of the things that I noticed when I was in Rojava was how much people really wanted critique. I was asked over and over again, sort of, what do you see here as you travel around? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? So I think that piece by Jeff Miley and Jihad Hami is an important contribution. And I think that it will make for an interesting discussion. At the same time, I think that, we also have to be patient. Like, the left is so often so focused on, division. And fortunately, see, I don't interpret their critique in that way. I think it is a very positive critique. And I think that we shouldn't, we should also give people room to breathe. I mean, these folks have been fighting ISIS. They have been completely starved by embargoes. At various times, Turkey has completely shut off the water supply to more than 1 million people. So I feel that Rojava still remains an extraordinary example of what can be accomplished when people really are empowered at the local level. And I'm not going to go into all the details. It's a whole separate conversation. And it sounds like from what Ash said, that you'll be able to have that conversation in a few weeks with another book about Rojava. So, but I do think that we have to give them credit also for doing something very extraordinary that hasn't been done before in this century, essentially institutionalizing local assemblies. And by the way, talking about lessons, I think the American left could really learn a huge lesson from what they've done in Rojava, both and very importantly in terms of the empowerment of women. My father in his work really does talk a great deal about patriarchy and the exploitation of women, but in Rojava they've really taken that to the next level, and that is really thanks in great part to the thought of Abdullah Öcalan, who has really made women and their empowerment a central tenet of any, of the revolutionary goal, with the idea that you cannot have a free society until women are free. And too often in radical or transformational or revolutionary projects, the women have been pushed aside. We'll sort of get to your issues after the revolution. So, that's one area where there's just tremendous inspiration coming out of Rojava. And the other is that, they've institutionalized these things. And yes, there may not be as much participation as people would like. There's certainly room for improvement, but wouldn't it be extraordinary if here in the United States, say, or in Western Europe, we had begun 30 or 40 years ago to actually empower people at the local level, doing what, in fact, the Republicans are doing right now, taking over school boards, city councils, and et cetera, and instead actually started to build and institutionalize power at the local level so that we could have a truly significant countervailing power to that of the nation state. That's just a little there on Rojava.
No, I kind of want to keep rolling with that because that was very well said, Debbie. And maybe before we get to more of the philosophical questions, there is a person here who states that they just attended a rally for the Poor People's Campaign. And they feel kind of struck by the gap between activists on the ground and some of the more, heady, as they put it, and they assure they don't mean that in a negative way, but like the heady kind of thinking that we're discussing here. So they're wondering, how do we make these ideas more relevant to activists on the ground here?
Well, I'm happy to discuss that. And also, of course, Todd, if you have any thoughts and want to jump in, feel free. It's funny. I know that this conversation, because it's a philosophical kind of grounding for the whole theory of social ecology, sounds heady, and there is a great sort of philosophical aspect to this that I think is important. But I also think that my father's work can be addressed or can be pertinent on many different levels. So, for example, if you want to get into a really deeper, just in the way that Todd is doing so brilliantly, into the really deep sort of philosophical issues that are taken up in this book, and see them, there's here a book on which is basically all about my dad's concept of dialectical naturalism. It's by Damien Gerber, and it's called The Distortion of Nature's Image. And it's very philosophical, and it really gets into a lot of the details that, for example, Todd has been elaborating. But there's also very practical aspects of this work. And for that, since we had such a great conversation, I would urge people to check out on YouTube, the conversation that again was sponsored by Firestorm Books, in which 16 Van Utreve did a beautiful presentation of her introduction to this book, From Urbanization to Cities. And here in this book, there is so much pragmatic information, there's, and in other books by Murray, including The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies, and The Promise of Direct Democracy, where he really gives, in many ways, almost like a template for how he thinks the left could embrace some of these ideas and make very concrete steps towards, activating municipalist organizations, meeting in small groups, starting to run candidates for local office. So in terms of how to get the word out to activists, I guess I would say that, this happens in the process of education. It happens in the process of discussions like the one that we're having here. And that I think it's been difficult in this period, especially because of COVID. But I think that more and more there's a sense that we have to reclaim our communal spaces, and we have to meet together. We have to talk, read, discuss ideas, and begin to think about how we can go beyond protests. And I think that, protests and rallies are important, but it feels like there's this constant ebb and flow where we go from one protest, there was the great Women's March after Trump was elected, but in general, the women's movement hasn't been able to kind of coalesce into a strong force. And so I think that we have to start figuring out how, and he has many ideas about this, how to begin to institutionalize our movements in the sense of bringing together people at the local level, organizing, and then electing people, and slowly kind of using a municipalist politics to counteract the incredible sort of statist politics or centralized politics that the left has heretofore tended to embrace.
Yeah, I'll just say a
Do you have
little
any
thing.
thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say a little thing about that. I hate jargon, so I think that that it's imperative on philosophical, theoretical writers to be as accessible as possible. And I'm not sure that I mean, obviously there's a difference between theoretical work and practical politics, but I think the barrier is much more permeable than we think it is. And I also think Debbie's point is really good that too often I think leftist movements are purely negative, like they're purely like, we're going to fight against this or against that. And I think one thing I really like about Murray is there's a positive program to it. And I think that's kind of what theoretical work tries to do, to like articulate some kind of positive program. So I see the point. Like, no one's ever accused me of being heady before, but I guess I don't know. I guess that's okay. But I think that like there's a clear, to me at least, there's a clear connection between the two activities. Like, it's not like there's theoretical thing on one side and then practical thing on the other. So I think that they have to work together.
Great, yeah. Well, maybe, okay, so maybe we can dive into a more sort of philosophical question then that might have some jargon attached to it. But there's a person here who sort of states that it seems to them that one of the key tasks of this book, The Philosophy of Social Ecology, is to transcend historical materialism as a dialectical philosophy in which Marx's historical materialism views nature in opposition to human society and justifies the domination of nature in order to bring humanity out of the realm of necessity. So in your view, did Bookchin succeed in this book? Or do you see these essays setting the stage for dialectical naturalism to be further fleshed out?
Is this, you want to answer, Debbie, or?
Why don't you take that?
Okay, yeah, I'm happy to take it. So I think I'm going to answer this in a way that I loathe, but I'm going to say both things, right? Like I think it is successful, but it still is part of a ongoing project. So I think, and so a couple things. So Hegel wrote a philosophy of nature. So he writes this thing called the Encyclopedia. It's 3 volumes. The middle volume is called the Philosophy of Nature. And in that work, he specifically says evolution, it's nonsense, right? But he's pre-Darwin. So he's dead 28 years before Darwin writes Origin of the Species. So there's no sense of the possibility of dialectical evolution in the natural world. And so one of the things that I think could be developed, and Debbie pointed this out earlier, is that when she mentioned cooperation in the natural world, right? That I think the overwhelming neo-Darwinist model is one of a natural world full of competition, right? Because I think the prevalent word is, or the key word is scarcity. And I think that as long as, and this is true for economics more than any other field, like, right? So as long as the controlling term is scarcity, it's always going to be a capitalist schema, I think. And so I guess I would say there's a whole opening for thinking in terms of dialectics and evolution in the natural world that I think Murray is already working in that direction, but he's not a scientist. Like, I think that there's ways in which it could be developed scientifically. And as far as I know, no one has done that. So I think that he's already doing it, but I think there's a whole movement, there's a whole possibility for thinking that further, specifically on this dialectics of nature question.
Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Debbie? I think Todd has said it very well. And I'm happy to I see that there are some more questions have come in, so why don't we try and get to a couple others?
Yeah, there's somebody here asking, and maybe this would be a good one for you, Debbie, to comment on what they term as the virtual blackout of Murray's work and the greatly welcomed resurgence of his work. So do you have a sense of what this person might be talking about in terms of the blackout and now sort of a resurgence onto the scene?
Well, that's a very lovely question in the sense of, thank you for the compliment about it being greatly welcomed. My father wasn't an academic. He never even went to college, and he only taught sort of intermittently at the Institute for Social Ecology, which he basically co-founded, and briefly at a college in northern New Jersey, which Ash is familiar with, called Ramapo College, where he was basically given a professorship based on his books. So, so for a long time, much of his writing was sort of outside the traditional academic realm. I mean, he never would have anyway written in an academic journal, but he wrote in journals like Telos, and so sort of things that were on the margin, but mostly he did, for the great vast majority of what he did, he sort of self-published. And of course, most of this was really before the internet. So I think his work would be much more widely disseminated. Actually, it is much more widely disseminated now, but I think it would have been then. And also, I think that, frankly, because he wasn't an academic and there weren't traditional sort of citations of his work, that some of the, a lot of his ideas were just ignored and in some cases plagiarized. Even today, there are a lot of people who write about global warming who don't really give him credit for the ideas that he espoused literally 40 or 50 years ago, certainly when he first published Ecology and Revolutionary Thought back in 1964 about global warming, about capitalism. And so it's kind of, that's like one part of it, I think, which is just that he was slightly kind of, out of the mainstream. And the other thing is that, my dad is polemical, and I'm the first to admit that. I mean, he could be very strident, he could be very forceful in the way he made his arguments. And I think that old sort of the old revolutionary in Murray sometimes also kind of kept him outside of these traditional sort of either more academic or just sort of traditional arenas of debate. One of the things that has happened, which is really nice, is that one person who truly has given Murray a lot of credit is Abdullah Öcalan, and he wrote some letters basically through his lawyers to my dad, talking about how deeply influenced he was by social ecology. He called him a student of my father's, which is not to say that he isn't also, his body of work, Öcalan's, is purely his own too, and it rests on the shoulders of many hundreds of people, just as every social theorist does, rests on the shoulders of people before them. So to sort of say on a happy note, really the fact that basically 5 million people in the form of the Kurdish, the revolution that has occurred in Northeast Syria are now taking these ideas as expressed by Öcalan or incorporated into the work of Öcalan, that has really breathed some new life into my dad's thinking. And it's really nice to see that a lot of sort of new directions in the left have taken up some of the ideas that he started talking about 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And the other aspect of that is that I think that, people are turning to his work more now just because they're seeing that there's sort of the other alternatives just haven't worked. It's just the fall of the Soviet Union, centralized, socialist politics in the most traditional sense of the word, obviously a failure. even representative politics. You know, we keep trying to elect people to office who we think are going to be progressive, and then it turns out that, you know, they are impacted by other influences and money, and people fall prey to that. Representative politics basically is also very problematic, to put it mildly. So I think people more and more are seeing the local level as a terrain for really developing a truly emancipatory politics, and that's what his work was all about. So it is nice to see it recovered in that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, you know, working at an anarchist bookstore in, you know, Asheville, North Carolina, we carry lots of Murray's work, as well as other folks writing about kind of similar bottom-up, directly democratic. We had an event last week with Madibo Kadali, who talks about intimate direct democracy, another person who names Murray Bookchin as an influence. So yeah, there is someone who has asked about social ecology's relationship to the left. They say that leftism can combine hugely diverse and sometimes contradictory beliefs. And they ask, to what extent do you think Bookchin's social ecology is compatible or antithetical to other leftist ideas like Marxism, communism, socialism, I'll go ahead and say anarchism. And I feel like either Todd or Debbie, you can kind of take that up.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start first, but I think Debbie should say something about this. I think that he had, Debbie knows much more about this than I did, but he had a break with anarchism, and I think that, but I do think there is some overlap, of course. I think the more significant break would be with Marxism, and I think it ties to what I was saying and Debbie was saying earlier, and I think that he, like the teleological nature of Marxism, I think he wants to resist. And I also think that the material, interestingly, because I think a lot of leftists are really attached to materialism as a way of thinking about the world. And I think that Murray is not. And I think that he thinks, and this is an idea from Hegel. So Hegel's often, I even said it before, he's often grouped with idealism and thought of as an idealist. But he's actually, and I think this ties to the very notion of dialectics, that for Hegel, the point is you can't really say where causality lies, right? Like you can't say, oh, the material is what's the cause in the last instance, or it's the idea that's the cause in the last instance. Instead, both of the two, the idea and the material, are intertwined in a way that you can't separate the two. And so I think that is one of the things that drew Murray to Hegel, and that's one of the things that separates both of them from Marx. And I think that Marx's notion that we are, and this ties to, again, what Debbie was saying about this notion of potentiality and sort of becoming what you could be. Like for Marx, we're basically self-interested beings driven by our material needs, right? And one of the things I think is evident in Murray, and is certainly evident in Hegel, is that really isn't the base level. It's not just a question of like what we need to get to for shelter, what we need to eat. Like there are other, it's not like some kind of like Maslow or hierarchy of needs, right? Like there instead, certain things that might seem extraneous can actually be more important than eating or finding shelter, like being free, for instance. Like that can be more important for someone than having enough to eat. So I think that which would be, for Marx, that would be absurd. Like he would think that that's just an absurdity. So I think that to me is one way that there's a kind of, not incompatibility maybe, but tension between what Murray's trying to do and what Marx is thinking. And I think that's again, this, what I would say, a Hegelian root or a Hegelian, point within Murray's overall thinking. But that Debbie knows much more about this than me. So
I think you said it very well. Murray also sort of tried to kind of extend the dialectic sort of to the subject of, so society and nature relationship in a way that Marx, I think, never did. But I'll just address the anarchism part of this, because I know that there's a lot of people, who were very surprised when Murray kind of so-called broke with anarchism. And I'm sure a lot of folks out there who are anarchists are familiar with his pamphlet or small book, Polemic on Lifestyle Anarchism, which sort of preceded him finally saying that he was no longer an anarchist. Personally, I tend to think of communalism, his concept of communalism, as kind of the next step for anarchists. People can disagree on certain aspects of these philosophies. And I do think, it's important to remember, of course, Murray, my father, was an anarchist for many decades. And it was a very specifically anti-statist attitude that he had, which again differentiates him very deeply from, Marxism. And communalism is also very anti-state. So there's some very fundamental commonalities there. What communalism brings, I think, to the anarchist project is it says that we organize in a way in which we can really build institutions that will challenge the authority of the state, that it's not enough to just build alternatives, co-ops, separate institutions that sort of ignore the state, but that we really have to challenge the authority of the state. We have to ultimately break down the authority of the state. And that one way that we can do that is by really empowering people on the municipal level, which includes running people in municipal elections. And I know that, that there are a lot of anarchists who would oppose the whole concept of electoral politics. But I think for Bookchin, what his idea was that the people that would run on the local level, and this would be purely on the local level, not on the state level, not on the federal level, but on the local level, would be viewed as delegates, would be put forward from their neighborhoods as local council candidates that were not self-chosen, but that were delegated by the assembly, so that they are fully accountable to the assembly, and so that the politics is completely transparent and open, and that it is never something that a person conducts on their own, but rather a reflection of all the decisions taken by the assembly, and also complex, bylaws and a code of ethics. And that's some of what some of the municipalists are trying to do in various parts of Europe right now, is to make for a much more accountable, transparent politics. And so I don't really see that as at odds so much with anarchism. I mean, there are many other issues, David Graeber and I used to talk about the whole question of diversity of tactics. My father felt that this sort of the idea of festivals was just a way of being distracted from the hard work of organizing. And, the question of where you want to put your energy is always going to be one where, people can differ. But his program, I think, really does represent sort of just kind of, as I said, the next step in my mind of anarchism towards a politics.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. Somebody here asks, so kind of working off that sort of next step or sort of like program that folks could utilize in the form of sort of like running candidates or just the democratic municipalism. Somebody here asks, okay, so with that in place, how does that go to serve solving the ecological crisis or addressing the ecological crisis? do you have a sense of what some of Murray's ideas were about how a localized municipal movement would address the ecological issues that we're facing?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that question. You know, often people say, yeah, well, global warming, you can't solve that on a local level. But actually, you know, I would argue, and I think that Bookchin would have argued the same, that in a certain sense, the local level is very, very much the terrain for solving those kinds of, that crisis in particular, and many global crises, because it's really on the local level that many decisions are made, you know, certainly decisions that affect our carbon footprint, whether you're gonna, what kind of power plant is going to be put into place, what kind of public transportation is going to be put into place, how recycling is going to be implemented. But importantly, I think it's critical to mention whenever one talks about municipal politics, the idea of confederation. And again, you know, in his book, The Next Revolution, the book about popular assemblies, there's a whole, you know, piece that's just about how confederalism, it's called The Meaning of Confederalism, how that would work. And the Kurds, again, to their credit, have really been able to implement this very effectively. Each level of government sends delegates to the next level, and every community is confederated. So there's no reason why we can't have very powerful municipal institutions and organizations and assemblies that confederate, that delegate people to go to the next level. It's sort of the spokes, you know, idea, and that make decisions together for a region, and even in a national region, and even finally, frankly, internationally, because we really do have a capacity. There really is a mechanism for doing that, that as long as people are accountable, as long as decisions keep becoming, you know, come back to the local level, and people are able to inform their delegate what their view is, and then there's discussion at the next level, but people report back to the local level. I think that there's no reason why big decisions on a national and even international level can't be made that way. They certainly are made that way in Rojava. I mean, admittedly, that's just a region. It's the northern third of Syria, but it's a fairly large region. And the other, and you know, so that's sort of one aspect of it. I think confederation is very important to keep in mind whenever we talk about sort of local politics. And then the other thing that I just want to say is, there's nothing about this kind of politics that preempts the idea of having expert opinions. You know, people, not everybody at the local level has to be an expert on everything. People can make policy decisions, and then those can be carried out by the technocrats, you know, the people who have the expertise to do those, you know, to implement, say, a particular type of hopefully alternative technology. Not everybody has to be an expert on everything, and not everybody has to participate in every you know, subcommittee on everything. But the important thing is that we give people the opportunity to participate. I think that's what's really critical.
Thanks there. Todd, did you have anything?
No, I don't think that. That's great.
Okay. Well, gosh, we have so many questions streaming in here, which I think speaks to just how much comes from this book, how thought-provoking it is, and this topic, and you know, the way it sort of tugs on everything. But I think we'll just have time for one more question, and we can kind of use it as a closing kind of statement for the event tonight. So there is one person here who just asked that they were hoping to hear more from both Debbie and Todd about the biggest lessons or ideas that you think come from the philosophy of social ecology. What is sort of like, if you could share the thing that you feel is most impactful for either you or for people to know from this collection of essays?
Why don't I start so Debbie can have the last word, because she's going to be much smarter than me on this. So I just would say that I think that I'm going to come back to what I said in the beginning. Like, I think that seeing the way in which we're connected to the natural world through the way in which we're divided from it. I think it seems like a very paradoxical way of putting it, but I feel like in a certain way, that's the key idea, that there's this move from a first nature to a second nature. And yet that move is implicit in the first nature. And so there's always a kind of responsibility back to the first nature, even as we're transcending it. And so I think that to me is one of the really compelling ways that Murray has of theorizing social ecology in this book. And I think I don't remember what got X'd out of this book and what didn't, because there certain things got edited out, but Murray was in certain version of this book was very critical of certain social or ecological movements that wanted to preach a kind of harmony with the natural world. And I find I'm totally with him on that. And I think that one of the things that, like what I just described, that movement from first to second nature, and then a responsibility back to first nature, I think avoids that notion that it's all just one big harmonious whole. And yet it doesn't allow us to just believe in, as Debbie said, this Marxist notion or certainly capitalist notion that we're the masters of the like, as wrongly gets attributed to Descartes, we're the masters and possessors of the world, right? Like that idea, he didn't say that. But that idea, which I think is sort of permeates both the capitalist world and the actually existing socialist world of the 20th century, I think the book nicely breaks with that. So that would be what for me is the big takeaway. Debbie, I don't think we can hear you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. There was some background noise, so I muted. Just to build on that, that was lovely, Todd. Thank you. I wanted to just to build on that. First of all, most of what was changed in this revised edition was added, not taken away. So actually, interestingly enough, the critique in the book about Earth First and Dave Foreman was not only left in there, but even elaborated on through a combination of those. And part of the reason for that is I think that that's like one of the most really important and prescient things that Murray, in terms of his intervention into sort of that type of thinking that was coined as deep ecology, this idea that somehow everything in nature is equal and we shouldn't intervene, and its most hideous and misanthropic expression, this idea that somehow, well, if you have AIDS in Africa and it kills 30 million people, that's just nature taking its course. As I'm sure anybody familiar with my dad's thinking knows, this was just the most abhorrent thing to him, and really deeply profoundly upsetting to him, and it resulted in a very major critique of that kind of thinking. I think that now, and 20 years later, I think most people would really agree with his position. And the point that he's trying to make is, it's not that we shouldn't intervene in nature. It's sort of, as we've said throughout this conversation, it's that we actually have a imperative to intervene, and that we should neither mystify nature, this is sort of to follow on what Todd's saying, nor have a mechanistic view of nature, but rather see ourselves very much as part of nature, the part rendered self-conscious, to really make for the kind of dialectical expression of a nature that is truly harmonious and free, both on the sort of environmental level and on the social level. So to me, I think that's one of the big takeaways for me from the book and important messages of the book. And I think also that for me, another aspect is just his whole dialectical way of looking at the world. And I think that for me, one of the biggest lessons sort of that I learned from my father is to really remember that nothing is static. Everything is in the process. It's not being, it's becoming, you know. And as he said in one of his really early essays, our being is becoming, you know. And that is so important because it's so easy to get sort of stuck and think, well, wait a minute, you know, this is how things are. And, you know, and it's important to see that everything has a latent potentiality and that we as part of nature are really an extraordinary expression of that potentiality. And we have the potential to create a social and environmental world that is truly magnificent and truly an expression of freedom.
My gosh, thank you so much for summing that up and sharing those ideas and those reflections. For folks who are still here, I have dropped links in the chat there. There's one link to all of Murray Bookchin's work that we carry at the bookstore, and then there's another link to the Philosophy of Social Ecology. So thank you to everybody in the audience tonight who came, and you know, there's 11 more questions in the feed. Unfortunately, we're not able to get to all of those tonight, but maybe some of those questions that you have are answered in the book. So please do pick up a copy if you're interested, and stay on the lookout. I think Murray Bookchin's The Modern Crisis is going to be released later this year. In August, I think, is the last that I saw through AK Press. So folks who have questions about Murray's take on the ecological crisis and where we are headed, that will very much be captured in that book as well. So yeah, thank you to everyone who came out to ask really engaging questions. And Debbie and Todd, it was a real honor to host you and hear your reflections and hear you share your thoughts about Murray's work and what's to come.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ash.
Great.
Thanks everyone for coming.
And thank you to Firestorm.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Absolutely. Have a good night.
Okay.
Goodbye now.
Bye.